Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to talk about this topic because I started out in labor economics about 20 years ago. And then I was drawn into ecological economics, and it didn't let me loose since then. So this is the first time that I'm trying to bring them back together again. And there's a very good reason for bringing them together, because while ecological economics has made some progress, I have the impression by leaving out the social dimension and by not talking about macroeconomics as much as we should, not talking about labor as much as we should, there are blocks in what can be achieved in climate policy, in environmental policy, and so on. Hence, I think it's urgently necessary to bring the fields together. So I'm making a modest attempt to do that. I know that you like models. Me too. But I'm not there yet. So this is more like laying out the agenda, ideas, and I hope that you'll engage with that. And over the years, of course, we'll try to present models along these lines. Ignoring nature. Well, the question is how long we can do that. Here, Coyote is rushing after Roadrunner, as they always do. And he was so fixated on his target that he didn't see that there was a cliff. And for a moment, he doesn't realize and stays there. Somehow gravity isn't applying to him for that moment. Of course, the next moment he realizes and he plummets down only to jump up and run again. But of course, that wouldn't work in real world. When we take this metaphor, well, we've been running and being very fixated on this goal of achieving higher GDP, higher growth. And it's not that there weren't signs, warning signs on the way. About 40 years ago, a small group of researchers, 16 researchers at MIT, under the direction of Donella and Dennis Meadows, wrote a quite influential book for the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. It may not have been the most brilliant economic modeling, but it was a big job. I mean, a systems model for the whole world, taking resources into account, food, population, and the economy. And here are some of their runs. The left one is the standard run, which is sort of not doing much. Sorry, it's very muddled. You probably can't see it from there, but I need that for the next slide. And this was when they started out. This is roughly now. And what they've said was that, well, there is actually still time to adjust. Industrial production will still go up for a while. Ultimately, resources will start to come down because they're running out, and pollution will go on for a bit longer, but then also come down as output goes down, and ultimately population will have to crash as food gets scarce. Really not a happy picture. But at the time when they published it, there was plenty of time. And that's what they said, because it was generally perceived as doomsday and gosh, they're saying the world comes to an end and whatnot. That's exactly what they tried not to communicate. And what's important also is that they had quite went out of the way to develop alternative runs, for example, a sustainable run, and try to illustrate what could be done, what could have been done in 1972. They also did an update 20 years later and 30 years later, basically sticking to the same message but updating the data behind it. And 3 years ago, somebody in Cairo, Mr. Turner, 4 years ago, sorry, checked on sort of their forecast, although it wasn't really forecast what they were doing. It was very clear they didn't want to forecast what was going to happen. They wanted to explore the complex reality. And therefore, they were scenario runs. But even with that qualification, comparing to the real data, it is amazing, it is staggering how close they were in the standard run, unfortunately, not in the sustainable run, how close they were in the standard run to the data that we are observing. The purple dots are what we are observing, the green ones are the standard run, and the blue ones would have been the sustainable run. So we're on course. but not on a good course. So just some more data behind that. Global resource extraction has been going up enormously since the beginning of the since 1900. That's not surprising at all. But what we see is that especially since 1950, there is a period of acceleration. What's the positive message from this graph is that, well, GDP has gone up a lot more than resource extraction. So yes, we have increased productivity, we've become more efficient in producing. That's great, but we've produced so much more stuff that, of course, the absolute amount of what we have extracted from the natural environment has gone up a lot too, probably too much. Another representation of the same information is, well, who is actually using and who is extracting that stuff. This is a production logic, so it's not the consumption logic. The bars are what is being extracted in and used in the particular countries or regions, world regions, and the people signify the per capita use. This is domestic material consumption, which is domestic material input minus exports. And what we see is, well, for example, that Australia is the biggest per capita user of natural resources, well, but followed by the US. China has increased its material use enormously in absolute terms, also per capita, but especially in absolute terms. Europe has gone up a bit, but not very much. When you look at Russia, ex-USSR up there, whoa. They've dematerialized. Well, but of course, all for the wrong reasons. We could go more into details of that, which I'm happy to do in the discussion. Who has seen this picture? Okay, some of you.
I had seen it because I heard you before.
That doesn't count. That's a graph that was published in 2009 by natural scientists, and has become quite famous since then. What it says, what it tries to illustrate, is to what extent we are pushing or have surpassed the planetary boundaries. Let me explain. The green area in the middle signifies the safe operating space. While we are in that area, we understand roughly what's happening. Of course, we will always have an impact on the environment. That's clear. Yeah? But the question is, to what extent? Compared to what natural scientists tell us is safe. Well, this is, of course, a matter of dispute. What is safe? Of course, we could have radically different ecosystems. We could have radically different climates. But the question is, do they deliver the sort of energy, the sort of food, the well-being that we enjoy at the moment or not? And of course, the natural environment can never be stable. So it's a question of what is considered safe. But for example, for climate change, a concentration of 350 parts per million, natural scientists have come to an agreement, is considered as safe. Beyond that, we are triggering changes that can spin out of control. We don't understand them properly, and they may have feedback loops so that they cannot be reversed. So it may be irreversible. Yeah. There are multiple dimensions: ozone acidification, ozone depletion, nitrogen use, phosphor use, freshwater use, change in land use, biodiversity loss, and so on. There are a few that haven't been quantified. With regards to climate change, the top one, you're probably not surprised that we have surpassed the safe operating space. Maybe a bit more surprising is that in terms of the nitrogen cycle, we're also way out of the safe operating space. That has a lot to do with the sort of agriculture that we have, the industrial agriculture, the use of fertilizers and so on, which have altered ecosystems enormously. And maybe also a surprise is that in terms of biodiversity loss, we're way out of the safe operating space. Nobody knows exactly what would be a necessary amount of species that we have for having stable ecosystems. But what we do know is that at the moment we are having such an impact that the species loss is 100 to 1,000-fold compared to the natural background rate. We don't know exactly what impact that has, but the danger is that it creates instability in the ecosystems. So there is at the moment also an effort to create an international panel, or it's being set up at the moment, an international panel, just like the International Panel for Climate Change for biodiversity, to hike that on the political agenda. In terms of climate change, recently, last month, the Working Group 1, which looks after the physical science base of climate change, has reported, of the IPCC, has reported. And, atmospheric CO2 concentration has gone up, of course. And I've just said 350 parts per million are considered as safe. That's about here. And we are outside the safe operating space. We've surpassed 390. The 2 degrees increase, a maximum increase in average temperature worldwide that the world community has agreed on corresponds to 450 parts per million. So there's still some way to go to that level, but of course it's not much margin, and of course that means a change, and a change that a lot of people say is too much of a change, but anything below that is not possible anymore. It's not possible to stop before 450 parts per million, and even that is a massive challenge to achieve. On the right-hand side is the annual average temperature increase, and at the bottom, attempts were made with models to distinguish the natural forcing, meaning the natural causes for climate change, because there are, of course, natural causes, but there are, of course, also anthropogenic causes. And the pink ones are the anthropogenic ones, and the purple ones are the natural causes. So the anthropogenic are significant and big. Changing climate leads to changes in extreme weather and climate events, not only in increases in average temperature increases. Since 1950, extreme hot days and heavy precipitation have become more common. And the International Panel for Climate Change has an own panel, an own group, SREX, that is reporting on the risks of more extreme events, and they have reported, and model runs have been done across the globe, and they're expecting more extreme hot days and heavy precipitation. There's an interesting group in London. It's called an NGO. It's called Carbon Tracker, and what they have been doing in the last few years is keeping track of the carbon budgets, because in 2010 governments confirmed in the Cancun Agreement that emissions should be reduced to avoid a rise in global average temperature by more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with a possibility of revising it down to 1.5. That's well known. The approach that's behind it is carbon budgets. It's been calculated what sort of carbon budget, meaning how many emissions, how many CO2 emissions, methane and other greenhouse gas emissions we can still emit in order to stay within that agreement. So they have calculated that the carbon budget for the 2 degree scenario would be around 565 to 886 billion tons of carbon dioxide by until 2050. The total carbon embedded in the world's indicated fossil fuel reserves are 2,860 gigatons. So 565, which we could emit in order to stay within the 2 degrees, compared to 2,860, what has been found. So our big problem is, of course, peak oil, isn't it?
No.
It's quite the contrary. We have too many fossil fuels, actually, as these numbers show. Yeah? We cannot burn all that has been found. Whoa. Fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. Whoa. That's a new challenge. I think humankind is quite good in finding more efficient modes of using a resource that is becoming scarce. We've seen that over and over again, where we're switching to alternative modes. And it's not that there aren't any alternative modes. I mean, renewable energy, lots of solar energy and so on, it's there. But the reason for switching isn't very prominent, because we have all these fossil fuel reserves. And they aren't held by small companies that are community-owned. They are held by big players. And the overload, the excess reserves have been calculated by the Capital Institute in London as being worth about 27 trillion pounds. That's the excess. So we could have used up, if we had been more clever about the financial sector, we could have used all that money that was wasted and bought up these reserves and at least got that economic interest out of the way, but unfortunately that's done. Can't be done anymore. So we are talking big money. We're talking heavy economic interests, and therefore it's not surprising that we are not making more progress. So only 20% of the total fossil fuel reserves can be burned by 2050. Leave the oil in the soil, the coal in the hole. That's what some activists have said. But that's really new thinking, and how to achieve that is a massive challenge, and I think it needs the input of economists to help with that, to come up with clever mechanisms. As a result, the global economy already faces the prospect of assets becoming stranded, with the problem only likely to get worse if current investment trends continue. In effect, a carbon bubble. So that's a new type of bubble. Normally we don't know whether something is a bubble until it bursts. Well, here we can predict the bubble, so we need to do something about it. Coming back to this diagram, we've been talking about climate change. But of course, environmental concerns are much broader than decarbonizing the economy, although that is the most prominent, the most politically sensitive at the moment. There is also biodiversity. There are ecosystem services that are being delivered, but since bees don't tend to send invoices, we don't tend to take it into account in our economic decision making. We only realize once the bees get ill, as they have come in recent years, and apparently it's a combination of factors. Pesticides playing an important role, stress over land use, a lot of different factors coming together, and they have led to a situation where bees aren't always doing what they're normally doing. But 70% of our food provision depends on bee pollination, and not just bees, but pollination. So they're actually quite crucial. Their work is quite essential for us. It's an ecosystem service. It's a service that we get from our ecosystem without having to pay for it, until they don't do it anymore, and then we have to employ people, like in this Chinese orchard, where they were with little brushes, where they were pollinating the apple orchards, and it costs, and it's not as good as the natural version. So we need to look after our environment, otherwise it can become expensive, and of course it has also an intrinsic value. Earth scientists have decided that humans have had such a strong impact on the globe that we should call the era that we live in now and give it an own name, the Anthropocene, namely the era that is dominated by humans. So it's not the Holocene anymore, but the Anthropocene. What colleagues and I in the WWW for Europe project that has been mentioned at the beginning have been working on is to bring together this idea of planetary boundaries with socioeconomic concerns. So we have used the idea of the boundaries, biophysical boundaries on the outset, but centered well-being, human well-being and ecological integrity as the goals in the middle, and then have the ring of the open space for stock flow interactions delivering the services, that is the area where we can have different pathways of economic development, but limited by the biophysical boundaries on the outside, and always aiming for human well-being and ecological integrity. So I hope that's sort of as a conceptual picture helps to see where we stand as socio-ecological economists, if you want to call it like that. Of course, we're also concerned with equity. On the one hand, global equity, because sustainable development is a global issue, but also intergenerational equity, as well as intragenerational equity. So these are issues that we are concerned about, but it would be carrying coal to Newcastle to talk about this in this forum. And similarly to that. So the framing that we are taking is in stark difference to the preference approach that neoclassical economics is taking. That would be while the coyote is running and he doesn't see that he has already run over the cliff, as long as he doesn't realize he isn't falling, that's the same. As long as people don't know that there are problems, it doesn't show up in their preferences, and therefore for environmental economists normally it's not a problem. It's fine. Yeah? In ecological economics, we think, no, that's not good enough. So we do collaborate with natural scientists and take biophysical limits serious. But at the same time, sticking to the biophysical limits doesn't support us in thinking about socioeconomic change that is necessary in order to achieve sustainable development. Therefore, we are thinking about the implications for different groups in society, and the term that's being used these days is socio-ecological transformation. So I agree very much with Harvey when he says all ecological projects and arguments are simultaneously political economic projects and arguments, and vice versa. Ecological projects are never socially neutral any more than socio-political arguments are ecologically neutral. Here's a little game, just a small thought experiment that I'm trying. Engelbert Stockhammer has said in one of his publications, economic imbalances should be viewed as the result of interactions between inequality and financial deregulation. Well, in ecological economics, we would probably say imbalances in delivering prosperity should be viewed as the result of interactions between inequality, yes, financial deregulation, and insufficient environmental regulations. So there is some overlap, and I hope we can work together. One thing I would like to mention is sustainability is not only relevant for the long term. Temperature changes have already occurred. We have increased our average temperatures by 0.8 degrees already, and we are seeing the implications thereof already. I want to make 5 propositions. They're very short.
And you have 5 minutes.
Oh, 1 per minute. Okay.
12 propositions.
For work in a sustainable economy. The first one is unemployment can be kept low even in low-growth economies. That is, of course, controversial, but reviewing papers, the more interesting ones normally came to a conclusion, well, it's not such a strict relationship, it depends on a lot of factors. What I would like to know is on what factors does it depend and how can we design it such a way that we can, it can be satisfactory, it can be enough to have no growth or low growth and not generate unemployment. Otherwise, our ecological project is doomed because unemployment will always take the precedent as the short-term concern, which I understand. So we need to really address it and take it very seriously. This is just one example where the old beta from the old Kuhn relationship, but even there is a massive variety. Sometimes it's 0, and it goes up to a very large number. Proposition 2, a little bit provocative. Green jobs are an accounting exercise for political propaganda. yes, of course, there are very good suggestions for measures that can make a difference. There are some projects that are clearly positive. For example, green refurbishments are quite labor intensive and they are good for the environment. But when you look at the scale of what they have achieved, when you look at green budgets, how green they have really been in terms of the percentage, and when you look at the public talk that has been done about them, it's political propaganda. I don't say it has always to be like that, but that's what we have seen. A lot of bean counting, a lot of categorizing the rubbish collectors into green jobs suddenly. I'm not sure to what extent we're better off by knowing that the rubbish collectors are suddenly green. And of course, there are environmental technologies that are being developed which will help us achieve sustainable development. But why not make all jobs green? Why aim for a certain percentage? Therefore, I think it's problematic to have this framing. Again, I think there are measures, there are strategies. If implemented, it can be beneficial. But at the moment, they're contributing to the sustainability babble. Talking a lot and not doing much. Tranquilizer. Reducing working time is economically feasible. It's a proposition. Of course, it's a question of to what extent it happens in combination with the same real wages. But I think it's an essential aspect that we are talking and thinking about it and analyzing under what conditions working time can be reduced. Well, Keynes famously predicted that by the 21st century we would only be working 15 hours a week. He had a lot of positive, he was right on many things, awfully wrong on this one. We've had a historic decline in working hours, daily working hours from 1820, where we had 16 hours, down to 8 hours. Weekly hours have been going down from 80 to 40 or 38 hours. Paid leave going up from 2 weeks to 5 weeks. Pension age in Austria at the moment, the average pension age in Austria is at the moment 58 years, the real age. But labor household supply has increased from 60 hours to 70 or 75 hours, mostly because of the larger participation of women in the labor market. So the question is, how natural is a 40-hour paid working week, which we've had since the 1980s? And in many sectors, it is no longer the norm, but the exception. But there it's considered as a problematic change. What can we do in order to make it an attractive change? And what can we learn from the Netherlands, from the Dutch experience of shorter working hours, and not just shorter working hours for women, but shorter working hours for a broad part of the population. New Economics Foundation in London has been suggesting a new normal working hours of 21 hours. I'm sure they are not committed to the 21 hours, but the point is that probably it's more effective to change the normal working hours than asking people to work part-time. Two more propositions, which I won't talk much about, but I think they're essential for work in a sustainable economy, and that shows work as opposed to employment or labor. Because it's a broader concept that I mean. Decent work reduces illness and protects rights. The International Labour Organization, of course, has an agenda on that. It's also part of the Millennium Development Goals, and it's being discussed for the new Sustainable Development Goals that will be published in 2015. It's a no-brainer. Of course, we all want decent work, but somebody needs to look after it so that it happens. And the fifth proposition, employment depends on care and nature, and therefore it needs to be accounted for. So we need to account for care work, subsistence work, civic engagement. That is, of course, a claim, a call that feminist economists have been putting forward for decades. One way of looking at it, for example, is in this graph from Neva Goodwin, where in the economic activity in the middle, there is not just the business sphere, but there's also the core sphere, by which he means the subsistence economy, and the public purpose sphere, meaning civic engagement, societally desired work. And all that is embedded in the social context and again embedded in the biophysical context. And that's the very pre-analytic vision of ecological economics, namely that the economy can only function well if the society functions well, and again if the biophysical context is intact. So parallel to, there's a parallel between the unpaid care work and the unpaid ecosystem services, and we need to value them. There is an interesting network on Vorsorgendes Wirtschaften in Germany. They've deliberately decided not to translate it, but probably would be something like care work, but that's too narrow. It's sort of a feminist version of sustainable economy, which focuses on care, cooperation, orientation on what's necessary for the good life. Thank you for your attention, and I just want to highlight a conference that's coming up. I'm not involved in organizing it. I was involved for many, many, many years in helping with these sorts of events, but not anymore. So it's not my own event that I'm promoting here, but I would like to encourage you to apply for a session. Maybe the deadline is the 1st of November, and personally I would be very happy to see more collaboration between ecological economics and post-Keynesian economics. Thank you.